Welcome back to another fun-filled show. I'm your host. He is Blanchard, aka Free Blanch, aka Blanche Stradamus, aka Blanchy Kruger. And today's title is The Arab Slave Trade Exposes the Black Programming. Now, I want you all to think about how Black people have all the smoke for white people, specifically white Americans for slavery in America, but they don't have any smoke for the Arabs. And what you're seeing currently is a rise in Islam in the Black community because Islam is seen as the more virtuous religion because of its outward expression. So, in other words, Muslims pray 5 times a day. They wear different clothing a lot of times. It's a very performative religion where it's very showy. You pretty much show the world what you're doing. And so that's what makes Black people gravitate to the religion because it's all about a show. It's not really any internal work involved. Not saying that a Muslim cannot have any internal work, but these droves of Black folks going to Islam is because of what it appears to be. Not only is it seen as a more virtuous religion than Christianity, because it is put against Christianity and it is put against whiteness, but it's also a religion that is seen as anti-establishment. It's seen as rebellious. It's seen as non-conforming. Back to the attire, women wearing hijabs and all of that. So again, my point is that this rise in Islam could be strategic. More than likely is. It's really coinciding with the pro-Hamas, I guess, anti-Israel protests. And honestly, there was a buildup of this mass Islamic movement in America. It was building up. And then we had those protests against Israel and then being pro-Hamas because of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Anyway, my point is that my question again is, why don't you all have any smoke for the Arabs? Now, it's a fact that the Arabs dominated the slave trade and they were the most brutal slave owners. Now, we're going to listen to a well-known historian, Thomas Sowell, and he's going to be talking about the Arab slave trade. But keep in the back of your mind that you all don't have any smoke for what Thomas Sowell is about to share with you all. Today's title is The Arab Slave Trade Exposes the Black Programming. The reason why you all are gravitating towards Islam, or the reason you all are enamored with Islam, or the reason why you all respect Islam so much is because Islam is seen as anti-white and anti-establishment and anti-Christian. That's why you all are gravitating to the religion. It's no other. It's not a spiritual journey. It's not this enlightenment. You didn't have a dream about Muhammad. You didn't eat some halal. None of that happened. None of that happened. It's simply because it's seen at the end of the day as anti-white and anti-Western culture. You know what I find funny? That when you all leave the faith, you never say it's for a spiritual reason. Like when you come to the faith, you all have great stories about how you came to know who Christ was. But then when you all leave the faith, it's always what somebody told you, what you read, what you saw. It's never spiritual. Think about that. You all never say that God told you this is a false religion. You all never say that Allah told you it was a false religion. You never said your pineal gland told you. You never say that the melanin told you. You never say that the cosmos told you. You don't even say that the ancestors told you. You all never have a grandiose reason as to why you leave the faith. And you know why? It's because it's all cap. Anyway, let's get into it. We're going to have Thomas Sowell here. Let's see. And I'll be jumping back and forth, pausing it and whatnot. Let me just do it like this. I'm sorry. Just let me get it. I'm sorry, y'all.
Although the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa imported more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than did the European offshoot nations of the Western Hemisphere, there are in these Muslim countries today no such large, discrete, and self-conscious groups of black African descent as the 60 million Negroes currently living in the Western Hemisphere. Among the reasons for this anomaly were the higher mortality rates of slaves in transit to North Africa and the Middle East, their greater vulnerability to the diseases of that region, and a very low rate of reproduction. Because the slaves were brought from long distances, often from isolated villages, they might lack biological resistance to the diseases encountered along the overland slave trade routes or at their final destinations. Although manumission was widespread in Islamic lands, the beneficiaries of this were often military slaves and others in higher occupations, where the slaves were most apt to be white rather than black. In general, black slaves were used in more menial and laborious tasks, and it was these slaves who were most likely to live and die as slaves, with their children being born into slavery. They had few children, however, for both marriage and casual sex among slaves was suppressed. Moreover, the death rate among those few children was so high that they rarely lived to adulthood.
Now, I want you all to think about this for a second. Think about all those millions of slaves that the Arabs had. And again, the Arabs dominated the slave trade. Yet today, you don't see any Africans in that area. Think about all of those slaves. Now, you all claim that white folks were the worst, but you still see black people in America today, millions. You still see black people in Brazil. You still see black people throughout the Western Hemisphere, like Thomas Sowell said. And I'm just using black as a generic term. Of course, no one's black and no one's white. But imagine all of those slaves they captured, and you don't see any of those people in the region. And he just told you that they couldn't really get married. They couldn't really have casual sex. They had a high mortality rate among the adults and the children. So already the Arab slave trade is worse than any kind of slave trade around the world. And y'all can make up these fabricated stories about breeding farms and all this nonsense and all that. But a breeding farm doesn't make two cents, that either. But a breeding farm doesn't make too much sense if it takes 9 months to have a child. A breeding farm will make sense with an animal where the gestation period is shorter. But a 9-month gestation period for a woman, it doesn't make sense to have a breeding farm. Each woman that gets pregnant has to wait 9 months. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense. But of course, y'all don't care about that. But back to this Arab slave trade. So already the Arab slave trade is worse than this so-called North American slave trade. It's already worse. And it's worse by the fact that you don't see any Africans in that area. Let's continue.
The widespread use of eunuchs in the harems of the Islamic countries further reduced the ability of the African slave population to reproduce itself. In the 10th century, the court of the Caliph of Baghdad reportedly included 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. With the passing centuries, as European nations grew militarily stronger and became better able to resist the Islamic nations, European slaves became scarcer in the Islamic lands to which they had once been sent in great numbers. Their importation was drastically reduced in the early decades of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia conquered the Caucasus, from which European slaves were being shipped to the Ottoman Empire.
So now you had the Arabs were not only enslaving the Africans, but they were also enslaving white people. Again, you all have been programmed. You all are under heavy programming and propaganda. You mean to tell me the Arabs had the most brutal slave trade and they were enslaving white people? Now, why isn't this in your history books? Why don't all your great leaders bring this up? Why don't the Democrats bring this up? Why don't liberals bring this up? Why are all of the people on the left so pro-Islam and pro the Arab community? Why? Why? Because of some false propaganda about people were anti-Muslim and anti-Middle Eastern? I can't tell. I can't tell. As many Muslims and Middle Easterns and Arabs I see in America, I cannot tell that America is anti anything coming from the Middle East. But anyway, dear Black people, you have been programmed, you have been propagandized. The Arabs were not only the most brutal, but they were also enslaving Europeans along with Africans. And if you all aren't familiar with what a eunuch is when the man has his members removed so that he can have no procreation capabilities and his desire for a woman will be drastically reduced. So when I talk about it being brutal, that's how brutal it was.
However, as late as the 1850s, orders against the traffic in white slaves from Russian-controlled Georgia and Circassia were being issued by the Ottoman government. By the end of the 19th century, white slaves had virtually disappeared, except in Arabia, while black slavery was not abolished in most Islamic countries until the period between the two world wars of the 20th century, and still existed in Mauritania and the Sudan at the end of the 20th century.
So you mean to tell me that these folks had slaves, the Arabs, all the way into World War I and World War II, and even beyond that? Because we're going to discuss how slavery still exists today. You mean to tell me that the Arabs not only had the most brutal slavery, not only were they enslaving Europeans, but they also had it all the way into the modern era. And y'all don't even mention it. You all don't even mention it. You know why you don't? Because you've been programmed and you've been propagandized. I keep telling you all that you don't know anything. This is why I tell you all, you don't know anything. You've been programmed.
The horrors of the Atlantic voyage in packed and suffocating slave ships, together with exposure to new diseases from Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of all slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels in the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara, was twice as high. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting the last desperate efforts to reach water. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans, often because their feet had swollen from walking across the hot sands, were abandoned in the desert to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. In 1849, a letter from an Ottoman official referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. On another route, it was said that someone unfamiliar with the desert might almost be able to find his way just by following the trail of skeletons of people and camels.
Now, they talk about the Trail of Tears, but they never talk about this trail of skeletons. Now, they got the Trail of Tears, but they don't talk about the Trail of Skeletons. All these black Africans that y'all love so much, dying by the thousands, being treated brutally. You all love talking about, people being thrown overboard on the ship. How about you just being left in the desert to die? How about you being tossed to the wayside because your feet are too swollen? Little girl can't keep up, throw her to the wayside. Woman can't keep up, throw her to the wayside. You all don't even mention the brutality of the Arab slave trade. It's horrible. Hollywood won't make a movie about it. There are no TV shows about it. All they want you to care about is slavery in America, as if the rest of the world wasn't practicing slavery. Again, Black people, you have been programmed. You are in the Blatrix.
Widespread loss of life began with the initial slave raids. As late as 1886, an Austrian who was an apologist for slavery nevertheless reported, "Negro villages are burned, all the men killed, and their women and children are taken on months-long, terrible marches." The march from slave-gathering areas, like the region around Lake Chad, across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean Sea, took about 3 months, and often only the strongest survived. Other slave routes to Islamic countries were over water, but this meant risking interception by the British Navy, and that in turn often meant that slaves were thrown overboard to drown, rather than being allowed to remain on board to be discovered as incriminating evidence.
So you mean to tell me they were going to the villages, killing all the men, and then taking the women and children? And then if they were on a ship, to avoid capture by the British, the white folks, they were throwing the slaves overboard. Think about the brutality of this Arab slave trade, and they don't even mention it. Think about the brutality of this Arab slave trade, y'all don't even know it exists. 99% of Black people don't even know this even exists. 99% of Black people don't even know that the Arab slave trade even existed. They want you to care about white people being slaves. Having slaves in America. But the Muslims were avoiding, the Arab Muslims were avoiding the white people, the British. It wasn't Black folks coming to save the day. It was white folks coming to save the day.
The trans-Saharan caravan route was the most deadly, however. It has been estimated that for every slave to reach Cairo alive, 10 died on the way. Nor was Cairo exceptional. Missionary explorer David Livingstone, among others, estimated that several slaves were captured for every one that reached the Mediterranean alive.
So they're talking about for every 10 slaves captured, 1 survived. A 10% survival rate. And y'all don't even mention it. A 10% survival rate, and you all don't even mention it. The brutality, the death toll, the trail of tears, but not the trail of skeletons. Dear Black people, you don't know anything. You are programmed.
Women were particularly vulnerable and were more in demand than men. They brought higher prices in the Islamic countries, where they were widely used as domestic servants or as concubines. Ethiopian women sold for higher prices than Negro women, and white women from the Caucasus brought the highest prices of all.
The white women, think about this now, even back then, the white woman was the highest out of the Ethiopian, African, or Black, Negro, whatever you want to call them. Out of the 3 women that were taken as slaves, white was the highest back then. Now think about it now. This is when whites were being captured as slaves. So there wasn't this situation that y'all love to pull out, this colonialism and white beauty standards and all that. Even when the Arabs were dominating, the most sought after slave was the white woman. Even when white folks didn't have this quote unquote position y'all talk about, not white women were still sought after the highest. I'm just saying. Don't get mad at me, get mad at history.
A special danger to men and boys was castration, to produce the eunuchs widely used in Islamic countries for work in the harems. Because the operation was forbidden under Islamic law, It was usually performed early and often crudely before reaching areas under the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. An estimated 90% of the men or boys died from the operation, though some groups of slave traders were sufficiently skilled to have much lower mortality rates. Eunuchs brought far higher prices than other slaves. Dead and dying.
Again, brutal. If you die, you either die from the surgery of getting your stuff removed, or you live and have your stuff removed and you're a slave. The brutality, no rights, no Emancipation Proclamation, no abolitionists, no nothing. Just straight brutality. And y'all don't even mention it. Y'all don't even mention it. It's actually a shame. It's actually disgusting.
Dying slaves were a common sight in the wake of a slave caravan. David Livingstone said that the common incidents of the slave trade that he had seen were so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. For example, one woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. It was not only the Christian missionary Livingstone who was shocked by the brutality of Arab slave raiders and traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. The prime destination of the African slave.
She couldn't carry the load and the baby, so they took the baby and cracked his skull till his brain spilled out. And y'all don't even mention it. That scene in the movie would have been etched in you all's soul. If y'all had saw some Arabs doing that on a slave trade, it would have been etched in your soul. This is how you know it's a setup. This is how you know it's truly an anti-white agenda, which is the anti-God agenda. Because there's no way that the Arab slave trade could be this brutal, this savage, and y'all don't even know about it. And those that know about it don't even mention it. You all should be ashamed of yourselves. You really should. You are mad at white people for slavery in America. Meanwhile, it's a group of people that dominated the slave trade. Way more brutal. Y'all don't even care. You know why you don't care? Because you're programmed. Hollywood said, care about this. Your TV said, care about this. Your politicians said, care about this. Social media said, care about this. Your history books care about this. Your favorite leaders care about this. You're programmed.
Slave trade to the Islamic world was Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the largest and busiest slave market flourished. There, women were paraded, examined, questioned, and bid on in a public display, often witnessed by visiting foreigners, until it was finally closed down in 1847 and the slave trade in Istanbul moved underground. In other Islamic countries, however, the slave markets remained open and public, both to natives and foreigners. In 1868, a British captain witnessed the scene at a slave market in Zanzibar. Rows of girls from the age of 12 and upwards are exposed to the examination of throngs of Arab slave dealers and subjected to inexpressible indignities by the brutal dealers. This market functioned until 1873, when 2 British cruisers appeared offshore, followed by an ultimatum from Britain that the Zanzibar slave trade must cease or the island would face a full naval blockade.
White people again ready to go to war to end slavery. White people. White people again coming to save the day, ready to end slavery. White people. White people had the conscience. White people had the morality. Ready to go to war over you bliggities.
This was part of a wider crackdown on the seaborne slave trade in 1873, which caused the trade to become localized rather than to disappear entirely. The treatment of slaves in transit by slave traders often differed from the treatment of slaves at their destinations, but this varied according to both the geographical destinations and the occupational destinations of the slaves. A domestic slave in Istanbul might receive much milder treatment than a plantation slave in East Africa. Although slaves in the Islamic world performed a wide variety of work, pearl divers in the Persian Gulf, seamen in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, agricultural laborers in Ethiopia or Zanzibar, domestic service was much more common in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere, and plantation labor was much rarer. Wealthier men in the Ottoman Empire often had harems with hundreds of women and substantial numbers of eunuchs to work there. In the Sultan's palaces, black eunuchs worked in the women's quarters, while white eunuchs worked in his court. Both sets of eunuchs included leaders who achieved a certain prosperity and influence, or even wealth and power, but of course they perpetuated neither their race nor their culture. Eunuchs were sometimes trusted with high military or civilian posts, on grounds that they had no incentive to try to establish a rival dynasty, nor were they likely to be corrupted from their duties by the seductions of women. While the treatment of slaves by their ultimate purchasers, as distinguished from the slave traders who brought them to market, has been considered generally milder in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere plantation societies, the evidence is much sketchier, for there was no organized anti-slavery movement in the Muslim countries, as there was in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere in Western civilization, to serve as a source of information on abuses of slaves.
An anti-slavery movement in all of the white countries. Well, I'll be darned. I'll be darned. No anti-slavery movements in any Muslim country. I'll be darned. No anti-slavery movements in Africa. I'll be darned. But they want you to be mad at white folks. It's a cold game.
There was no market in these countries for literature, such as the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, or for the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves. There was in general very little writing about slavery in the Islamic world, where slavery was simply not an issue. Plantation slavery in the Western Hemisphere was not surrounded by walls, and so could be observed by outsiders, many of them critical of the institution of slavery itself and alive to its abuses. What happened behind the walls of Ottoman Empire homes and palaces is much less known. Still less can anyone know today what was in the minds and hearts of those slaves, how they felt about being a degraded people in a foreign land, how a eunuch felt about being deprived of a normal family life, how a concubine felt about being made available without regard to her own feelings to her owners or to whomever her owner might give, lend, or sell her. What is known is that there was an extremely low reproduction rate among the Africans enslaved in the Muslim countries. Black women who had children sired by slave owners were sometimes freed, but the magnitude and effect of this phenomenon were not such as to leave a major black population in the region. The story of the African diaspora today is thus largely the story of the descendants of Africans in the Western Hemisphere.
Propaganda. Propaganda. We're just going to look real quick where slaves are today. The 10 countries with the most slaves are numbered. You got Russia, there's 1 million. You got North Korea, China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Pakistan, Uzbekistan. So basically, 9 countries of people of color, and then Russia. 9 countries of people of color, and then Russia. Still slavery to this day. These European countries, these Western countries, these truly Western countries, Europe, America, Australia, ain't no slavery. Some more graphs here. Just some say nearly 30 million, some say 40-something million current slaves today. You have some right here, you see some countries, Thailand, China, Gambia, Nepal, Ivory Coast, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. This right here is from 2015. All these slaves in India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, North Korea, Russia, Nigeria, Indonesia, Egypt. Again, my point is that You all have been programmed and propagandized. And the reason why you all are so enamored by Islam now is because you are being told to be enamored by Islam. Islam has been presented to you throughout Black culture and throughout Black history as something that was anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-white, anti-Christianity. That's why you have been so enamored with Islam. And plus the outward expressions of getting your prayer mat and praying 5 times a day and wearing different types of clothing, hijabs and those dresses and all that stuff, and eating halal food and going to Jumar and Ramadan. All this stuff is a bunch of outward expressions that Black folks like. Black folks like to look like the part and not actually be the part. And so Islam is right up Black people's alley because of Black culture. It's no substance. It's all about what it looks like, not what it actually is. I thank y'all for tuning in today. Hope y'all enjoyed the show. Thank you.